Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us today for Heritage Events Live. My name is Rachel Gressler, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, Safeguarding Worker Freedoms, What's Next in 2021. This will be part one of two in a mini-series that Heritage is co-hosting with the Institute for the American Worker. So I'd like to introduce my co-host, Vinnie Vernuccio. Vinnie is the president of the Institute for the American Worker, which is an organization that seeks to equip policymakers with the tools and the information that they need to stand up for American workers. Now, Vinnie has over a decade of experience in labor law and labor policy, and he is a well-known expert in this area. Vinnie is now going to introduce our great lineup of panelists who will be joining us on the screen here now.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Rachel and Heritage, thank you again so much for co-hosting this event. It is an honor to do this event, I4AW and Heritage. With that, I would like to invite our all-star panel up to unmute themselves, and I'd like to make some introductions. First on our panel is Erica Jediak, the Director of Economic Opportunity for Stand Together, the Stand Together Chamber of Commerce. She leads national strategy to remove barriers in government, business, communities, and education so every person can rise. She's been published in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. She's appeared on Fox Business. In her home state of New Jersey, she's been on New Jersey News 12. She also serves as the New Jersey State Advisory Committee on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. She's the former New Jersey State Director for Americans for Prosperity and was named New Jersey Globe's top 100 most powerful people and received the Athena International Leadership Award. After we hear from Erica, Ed Egge from the National Retailers Federation. He is their Chief Workforce Policy. He directs and executes policy efforts on labor, employment, health, benefits, retirement, immigration. And man, Ed, when do you even take a break? Those are a lot of areas, and does that all for the retail industry. Ed came to NRF after directing the National Labor Relations Board Office of Congressional and Public Affairs, and he also oversaw the board's interaction with Congress and other federal agencies, the media, and stakeholder groups. From 2005 to 2011, he was also Republican staff director for the Senate Subcommittee on Employment, Workplace Safety, which is a key subcommittee on the Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Subcommittee. Ed also has worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in their Labor, Immigration, and Employee Benefits Division. Last on the panel, we have, last but not least, Rob Green, who many of you know. He is the Director of Workforce Policy for the House Education and Labor Committee. He's responsible for the day-to-day workforce labor policy activities for the committee Republicans and providing policy guidance to members of Congress and leadership offices. Also communicates with external stakeholders and supervises a team of professional and administrative staff. Before coming to the committee, Rob was executive director at the National Council of Chain Restaurants. He's also served as vice president of government and political affairs at the National Retail Federation and vice president of the Federal Relations for the National Restaurant Association. And Rob has probably forgotten more about labor policy than any of us will ever hope to know. So that is our all-star lineup. And Rachel, I'd like to kick it over back to you.
Thanks so much, Vinnie. And I want to start off today with what's happening at the state level, because it's often the state policies that will trickle up and could potentially become federal law. In particular, there is one really harmful piece of legislation, that's California's AB 5 law, which effectively outlawed many types of independent work. You'll probably hear us all using that term, independent work. What it really refers to is just anybody who doesn't report to a boss or who is in charge of their own workers, self-employed individuals, freelancers, contractors, gig workers. Anyways, when California passed this law, a lot of independent workers started losing jobs and income opportunities left and right. These were independent truckers, freelance writers and photographers, court reporters, gig workers. So Erica, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in California with that law and also some other areas of the US?
Sure. Well, thank you, Rachel, for the opportunity to be here today. And many people have probably heard of AB5. It's been all over the news, particularly in the context of gig companies. And you mentioned, Rachel, that this is not just covering gig companies, but rather hundreds of professions in California. After California's AB5 at the start of this year, almost 1 million people have lost some type of income, and independent contracting has been essentially gutted in California. Now, because of the backlash, there has been some exemptions, including for realtors, and at the ballot this November, Prop 22 was passed, which does now exempt Uber and Lyft to some degree. It's interesting because this law, in many ways, was meant to tackle those ride-sharing companies, and now they've been exempted, and all these hundreds of other professions are still included. Folks, can go on to Twitter and just look at hashtag AB5 or hashtag AB5 stories and really get a sense of the economic devastation that we've seen. Folks like Kira Davis with Red State, she's written quite a lot about this, and even freelance writers have been included. Americans for Prosperity actually submitted an amicus brief in a Pacific Legal Foundation case representing journalists, because this is a free speech issue as well. So we've seen a ton of backlash that has not been partisan. It's been across the entire political spectrum. And unfortunately, we're seeing copycat legislation. So Vinny mentioned my home state of New Jersey. There's a bill here that was introduced by the Senate President. Senate President Stephen Sweeney. Fortunately, there's been a lot of backlash here as well, despite a very aggressive Department of Labor. But I think we will see, unfortunately, some threats pop up, likely in Virginia as well, but then some proactive opportunities, perhaps in Florida and elsewhere, Rachel.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Another issue that is big and differs across the state is that of labor unions and right to work individual rights that have a job without being forced to pay hundreds of dollars out of their paycheck to a union. So what's happening across the states with that issue?
Yes. So 27 states across the country are right to work. And it's interesting because the independent contracting issue in some ways dovetails into this. I know the rest of the panel will be speaking about the PRO Act, but all of these workers could be affected by federal legislation. Now, 27 states have passed right to work, essentially allowing workers the choice to be part of a union, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case in my home state of New Jersey. So a lot of workers don't have that choice to decide what's best for them and their families. But I think we're going to see states like New Hampshire, Montana, perhaps even Missouri in the coming years consider making these transformative changes. And so hopefully what's happening at the federal level doesn't affect what states are doing in the way of good policy.
Great. Hey, thank you, Erica. That was very illuminating, and I'd also remind everyone about the chat feature. If you would like to ask Erica any more questions at the end, or our coming panelists, please utilize that, and we'll be happy to take your questions. So moving now to Ed. Ed, with a potential Biden administration coming in, what do you expect that we could see coming down the pike in 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, sure. And appreciate you guys having me. And thanks to Heritage and the Institute for American Worker for hosting. It's a pleasure to be on with Erica and Rob. So let me start real quick by what I don't see happening. Every time I Google, labor law in the Biden administration, I tend to read a lot about the National Labor Relations Board. As Vinny mentioned, I just came from there. I spent a couple years there running their political operation and their relations with Congress. I think that's going to be the dog that doesn't bark over the next couple of years, depending on how these elections go down in Georgia. But assuming the Republicans can win down there, I just, I don't see Mitch McConnell putting another Democrat on the board. Right now it's 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat plus the 1 vacancy. So, all the what I think are good things that we did when I was at the board, when under John Ring's leadership, the chairman there, I just don't think there's going to be any successful efforts to overturn a lot of the precedents, a lot of the rulemakings that we put forward, whether it's employer access, whether it's joint employer, all the different things that that we did over there at the NLRB. I just think those are going to stay more or less untouched for the foreseeable future. Again, it's 3-1 right now. Member Emanuel is going to roll off in August. The following August, John Ring rolls off. So it's going to go from 3-1 to 2-1, and then it's just going to be 1-1. And then at that point, it's going to depend on those November 22 elections. So, so I wanted to sort of start with that. That's what is not going to happen. But what is going to happen is we're going to see a lot of activity in the Biden Labor Department. As Rob will well remember, when Obama comes in 2009, we had all sorts of horribles that we thought they were going to do, and then we got the blessing that was Hilda Solis's term there. Solis was anything but effective, right? So under the Obama administration, the first half basically they got little to nothing done. I don't think we're going to be that lucky again. We're going to get a Labor Department under a secretary who's experienced, who's politically savvy, who's well connected with the White House, and they are going to be very, very active. First things first, I think right out of the box is going to be an emergency temporary standard regarding the COVID-19 virus. This is going to be either harmful or it could possibly be even workable, depending on how they come out with it. The California regulation that just got promulgated, and I use the term loosely, it was a 10-day promulgation period. They put it in place over 10 days. It includes a leave provision. It includes mandatory testing of all your employees under certain scenarios. It is a very unworkable regulation. If they try to put something like that in at the federal level, under an ETS, I do assume it would go quickly to court. Federal ETSs have to meet a pretty high threshold whereby the danger has to be grave, is the actual terminology that the language uses, and OSHA has to demonstrate that the only way they can address the grave danger is through this standard. So it's a very, very high standard, but I do think they're going to try it very, very quickly. The second area I think you're going to see a lot of activity on is joint employer. What is joint employer? The very easy way to think about it is if you walk into a Starbucks, those people you interact with at the Starbucks, those are Starbucks employees. If you walk into a Dunkin' Donuts, the people you interact with are employees of the local franchisee, the local small business. Whether that individual owns 2, 3, 4 Dunkin' Donuts, depends on where you are, but it's going to be a small employer. The unions hate the latter model, right? They do not like the franchisee model. It's very hard for them to organize those workers. It's very hard to get class actions and on and on and on. So they are going to go after that model. So when we talk about when we talk about joint employer franchise issues, that's really the distinction we're talking about. They are going to try to make those franchisors, the companies that have the logo at the top, whether it's McDonald's, whether it's Dunkin' Donuts, whoever, they're going to try to make those guys responsible in the broadest sense of the term for those workers in the workplace. So that's going to be the second area. And then third, and Erica commented on this, we're going to see some federal activity on independent contractor, trying to blur that line between what is an employee and what is an independent contractor. Again, it's going to look a lot like what Erica was just talking about, so I don't want to go over that again, but we're certainly going to see those same efforts at the federal level.
Great, thanks, Ed. Appreciate that. When you say for the independent contractor and joint employer, it sounds like things may at least be stalled out at the NLRB. Do you foresee this coming through DOL through the regulatory process, and when do you think that might happen?
Absolutely, I think it's going to be. I think they're going to start the process. And again, this would be just a joint employer on the Fair Labor Standards Act, not on the National Labor Relations Act. NLRB would obviously have that jurisdiction, but there is some stuff, the Trump administration tried to put out a rule. It has now been enjoined by a court, NRF, and other and other trade associations are in the process of appealing that. But no, it's going to be, they're going to start working on both, I think, joint employer and independent contractor in the summer and fall of 2021.
Thanks, Ed. I think we're going to move over to Rob now and hear what's going on in Congress. I think there's been a lot of troubling legislation that's come out of the committee that you work for, Rob, over the last couple of years. I mean, troubling at least for those of us who care about worker freedom. So what do you see coming down the pipelines in the next year or two?
Well, thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it very much, and want to thank Heritage and the Institute for the American Worker for hosting this event. I think it's a great use of time, and want to thank both you and Vinny for putting this together. What I'll do is just amplify what Erica and Ed said, because I think in the legislative space, we're going to see a lot of similar themes, a lot of similar issues coming up. And I think we have a good roadmap based on what happened in this Congress, 116th Congress. It's still going on. Another week or so and things may be done. But the committee was very active. Committee Democrats were very active in the labor policy space over the last 2 years. They had a lot of pent-up demand, shall we say, coming back into the majority. So our members were willing to fight the good fight and to call the Democrats out for their overreach and for what we thought were a lot of bad policy ideas. So what I'll probably just do is tick through some of the legislation the Democrats processed in the last 2 years, which we think, likely they'll repeat that, because I think I think Democrats feel, regardless of Biden administration and an opportunity to achieve some things through the regulatory process, it's always better to process legislation and move the ball forward and see what you can get signed into law. So I think I'll start with the PRO Act, and everybody's very familiar with that very broad and sweeping and radical bill. It's really the labor union's kitchen sink wish list of every policy they've wanted to accomplish in the last 30 years. You have card check style elections, you have undermining privacy rights for employees, you have repeal of national right to work laws around the country, you have the codification of the California ABC test that Erica talked about. AB5 would be implemented, would be assigned into law without any exceptions. California, I think the legislature had to really backtrack and start exempting all their friends and family that were complaining about how unworkable that structure is. PRO Act basically just makes it a national law. So look forward to that in your neighborhood. So PRO Act is really bad policy. It also goes back to the Obama administration, and it reinstates a lot of the NLRB rulings from joint employer and Browning Ferris to ambush elections, and the list goes on. It's just really a sweeping and really radical bill. It passed the House earlier this year. It took Democrats a year to get to it for some reason, but it passed in February. We had 5 Republicans and 7 Democrats. 5 Republicans voted for it, 7 Democrats voted against it. So you can sort of see there is a path forward for that bill, and we fully expect Democrats to work very hard to bring that up in 2021. So moving on, Democrats also processed a bill that would nationalize a $15 minimum wage over 5 years. It took them a long time to get that bill up. They promised it in the first 100 days of Congress. It took them 7-8 months to navigate that within their caucus. CBO came out with a study in 2019 that says a $15 minimum wage could cost up 3.7 million jobs. I think the arguments are clear in terms of the impact of that bill in states that have a lower cost of living and are just have a different type of setup than New York versus Alabama. I think is a good contrast. So I just expect Bobby Scott, who's the sponsor of the bill and chairman of the Ed and Labor Committee, to make an effort to reload on that bill and to bring it up. And he has obviously President-elect Biden's support for that, who's one of the major issues that President-elect talked about was $15 minimum wage. So my guess is the House Democrats will want to amplify that and to promote that and move pretty quickly on that legislation. We're also looking at issues like paid leave. We've seen it within the context of COVID-19. FCRA was acted early during the pandemic. It provided, imposed a mandate on employers, but coupled with some relief on the tax side for paid leave for certain employees impacted by the pandemic. But we've seen Democrats talk about, it's a difficult situation we find ourselves in with the pandemic, but Democrats want to use that to their advantage and try to move larger policies. So expecting Rosa DeLauri's bill, the Health Families Act, to be a priority for Democrats, would require employers with 15 or more employees to provide 7 days of paid sick leave. And then smaller employees below 15 would have to provide unpaid sick leave. So we view that as just not good public policy, one size fits all. Also, I think Democrats have problems with the overtime rule, and they want to go back to the Obama rule, which set a really unrealistic threshold to qualify for overtime pay, close to $50,000 a year, and anybody earning below that would automatically be required to be paid overtime. The Trump administration came up with a lot more reasonable and rational rule, which sets that threshold at $35,000. So there's a bill out there from Congressman Takano to reinstate that. So we'll see what happens with that issue as well. Workplace safety, big priority for congressional Democrats. Ed pointed out that the OSHA would do an emergency temporary standard on COVID very quickly, but there's also legislation to require that. And my guess is the Democrats will want to move that bill because if you can enact that into law somehow, that it inoculates the department from lawsuits in many ways. So we're expecting a lot of conversation on COVID as it relates to OSHA's work. Democrats also want to expand OSHA in terms of penalties, coverage, employer requirements, privacy. There's a bill that Congressman Courtney has to dramatically expand the scope of OSHA and the OSH Act, and we see that coming in the near term as well. Democrats also want to deal with workplace violence in the workplace as well, so we'll see more on that. Employment non-discrimination, a couple bills passed the House this Congress dealing with equal pay, discrimination against older workers, and accommodations for pregnant workers. These bills all passed the House with modest Republican defections and very modest Democrat defections, if any. But those are all probably coming in the year 2021 because Democrats want to continue to both promote those issues and to try to advance those issues through the Senate, depending on what happens. So there'll also be a couple of Congressional Review Act efforts relating to some Trump administration regulations, DOL regulations, relating to mostly in the sort of retirement security space, but we should see some more of those coming in particularly in the spring because of the timing that the CRA requires. I think independent contractor rule, union transparency, and perhaps fiduciary rule will be on the CRA list. So that's a quick update and overview, but happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. One thing that's coming to mind is you were mentioning all of these agenda items. A lot of them, in light of COVID-19, have drawn to light the importance of having flexibility in your work, of having work opportunities as some opportunities are going away as businesses are shuttered or restrictions are put in place. And yet all of these things that you're mentioning would be taking away those opportunities. Things like the overtime threshold. I don't think people realize that what employers sometimes do in response to that, if you have an hourly employee, they'll often kick you off of your email server and you can't do anything remotely. It all has to be done in the physical office where you're actually punching the clock card. And that combined with the Democrats' smaller majority now, do you think that that will impact, what they're pushing for, or do you think that they'll still be as aggressive as they were in the past?
I appreciate the question. I think the jury's out on it a little bit, but I think we should be ready for the Democrats just to keep going forward as quickly and aggressively as they can. I think the dominant feature of the Democrat caucus is sort of the more liberal left-wing members, and they also populate the Education and Labor Committee. So I think there is continuing interest from many Democrat members to advance the policies that were brought up in the current Congress and also to add a few more to it. and they'll find a way forward. The speaker is very, I think, effective in terms of marshaling votes for priorities for their caucus and for the incoming administration. So I fully expect, I wouldn't be surprised, if when the Democrats advance many of these bills, maybe a little bit heavier lift for them, and our obligation and responsibility is to put up a very principled fight on those. We think we have a very good point of view on this, very realistic point of view to point out the shortcomings in their proposals. But my guess is the House Democrats and the committee Democrats in particular will not miss a beat, and will push very, very aggressively on all their priorities.
Great, thanks, Rob, and thank you to our panel. Those were fantastic presentations. I know I've learned a lot. And our attendees have sent in a flood of questions. So I just want to start with a couple of them. And the first one, I'm going to apologize to the asker. I am not going to answer because the question he has essentially has to do with sectoral bargaining. And guess what? We are going to have an entire session on that at the same time next week. That's actually round 2 of the joint Heritage I4AW sessions. So I'd like to invite you and the rest of the attendees to join us next week as well, Wednesday the 16th from 3 to 3:45. And we'll get into sectoral bargaining. We'll get into some of the benefits that we can see unions could actually bring forward, such as voluntary unionism. But we are going to be going into depth on that next week. So apologies for not asking the question this time, but I hope you will join, where we are going to definitely go into the weeds and explore that a bit more next Wednesday. Rachel?
Yes, so we have a question here, probably best answered by you, Erica, about how companies are dealing with the impacts of the AB5 law and the inability to hire these independent contractors. I know that it's actually small businesses that rely on independent contractors more. The companies that have 4 or fewer employees on average use 7 independent contractors. So imagine how that is hurting them, out in California, and what that could do to the rest of the US. Do you have any indication of what those companies are doing?
Yeah, so I think the initial reaction we've seen are businesses leaving California. And many of the independent contractors in California are small business owners themselves and employ independent contractors. I was just reading the story of Kathleen Lomax here in New Jersey. She's a doctor of pharmacy, and she has a number of contractors, and she was actually interested in having more flexibility and leaving the full-time grind of having a pharmaceutical job here. She wanted to, focus on other areas of her life with her children and travel. And for her, those kind of seasons of life, right, meant a lot. And she wanted that flexibility. And now with that under threat, she's speaking out. And so I think we've seen bigger businesses, even like 7-Eleven said, we're leaving California. We're not opening up any new businesses. And so I think that will have an effect in California specifically. Until Prop 22, Uber and Lyft, they were certainly having to reassess their business model and leave as well. And then the other aspect of this is confusion, right? So there may be different, the IRS has one standard, your state could have an ABC test, right? There's the US Department of Labor. There's all these different standards that small entrepreneurs have to navigate and figure out. And those come with pretty hefty legal costs, as well as complaints, right? So any kind of even unintentional misstep can come with a very, very heavy price tag. And we're seeing even state departments of labor have pretty aggressive decisions as far as how they deal with those. But I think the important thing here, Rachel, is with COVID-19, particularly, and the year that we've had, both workers and employers need more flexibility. I think independent contracting is just, it's ripe for working remotely. whether that's because of volatile school schedules or maybe transitioning careers. I've even read a study that people who have been independent contracting were set up more for success this year because they had multiple revenue income streams, right? And so there's a lot of benefits here, Rachel, that were particularly and could be particularly hard hit, you know, if we see copycat legislation in the states next year.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And I think, you know, that must be difficult for these small businesses that are out there, and it's even fines and, you know, legal imprisonment for classifying workers in the wrong way. And I imagine many of them are just struggling to get by and saying, I'm just going to do this and hire this contractor, and hopefully I don't get, you know, sued or put in jail for it in the long run. But that's not a position that we should be putting small businesses in. Benny, would you like to pull another question from the audience there?
Absolutely. And by the way, besides being president of Institute for the American Worker, I wear many hats, but I'm also an independent contractor. So this issue is definitely personal for me, and I love the lifestyle, and I hope that I can, you know, keep that flexibility in the future. So Erica, thanks for all your Stand Together and AFP's great work on that. Going to the next question, Ed, this might be best for you. I think you have your finger on the pulse here, but definitely open it up to any of the panelists. Who do you think the Democrats are considering for NLRB's general counsel? And can you go into a little bit of the detail of what's happening there?
So the general counsel position is an interesting position. I think it's very, very different from just about any other really federal role. So the NLRB has two different sides of the house. One is the adjudicatory side, which is the 3-to-1 ratio that I was talking about in terms of the side of the NLRB that essentially adjudicates labor law disputes nationwide within the private sector. The other side is headed by the general counsel, and it is much larger. These guys investigate and then prosecute employers nationwide for alleged violations of the National Labor Relations Act. He being the general counsel in the current case is Peter Robb. Peter also, in addition to being the in-house general counsel, also is the chief administrative officer of the NLRB. So it's a really kind of a unique role, and it's a very, very powerful role within the board and the agency structure. So who are they considering? So first off, we should say that Peter rolls off in November. There is a lot of scuttlebutt online that Biden will attempt to fire him. I'm not sure that will happen. If I had to bet on it, I would guess it won't happen, especially if the two Senate seats go to the Republicans. Why would you, if you were Biden, why would you go out of your way to antagonize McConnell? Because you're going to need him to get a Democrat in there. And why would you give him the perfect excuse to essentially never fill that position? So my guess is that won't happen, but it's certainly possible. At the very beginning of the Trump administration, the previous general counsel, Dick Griffin, the Democrat, stayed on for several months into Trump's term. So there's precedent here going the other way. So to answer the specific question as to who I think would get it, the names bandied about, most common, Jennifer Abruzzo, who was at the board and was actually acting general counsel for a very brief time at the very beginning of the Trump administration. Certainly Abruzzo, who I believe is the communication workers right now. Rob, you can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But anyway, I would say Abruzzo would certainly be a name that's out there. Other names that, you know, bandied about, there's certainly, gosh, there's a lot, I would say basically a lot from the union side that I think would be considered. But if I had to guess right now, it would be Abruzzo.
Thanks, Ed. We have another question here about unionization, and coming off of the Janus ruling have some implication for workers being allowed, at least public sector workers being allowed to opt out of unions. Erica, have you seen any trends in that public sector side, private sector side, and workers opting out?
Yes, so the Janus decision at the Supreme Court level reaffirmed free speech rights for public sector workers, and I do know that in a number of particularly blue states, we've seen on average about 15% of public sector workers opt out of their unions. make that choice. However, the unions and a number of state legislatures have been putting up a lot of barriers, right? I do think what we're going to see in the coming year are perhaps more states bringing their bringing their state into compliance with the decision. So what does that mean? Allowing workers to opt out at any time and also have affirmative consent. So that workers must have notified and actually said, right, I want to participate in that union, I want to pay dues, because right now some of those forms don't currently exist, but Alaska, Texas, and Indiana attorney generals have issued advisory opinions in the past year, so it's possible that we'll see some other states trend that way next year.
Great, thanks, Erica. One more question, and I guess I'll open it up to the entire panel here. Do any of you see any labor issues where a Biden administration will have a positive vision for the future, even if it's a potential incremental change in the next 4 years?
You know, from my members' perspective, and I don't want to jump on Rob and Erica, but my members' perspective, I mean, I think there are areas that we can work together with the with the Biden administration. Certainly, immigration is an area that we can find common ground, and trade policy is another area. Workforce development, workforce training, yeah, there are places we can work together. But on the traditional labor issues that we tend to be talking about here, no. I mean, I think we're pretty far apart. Rob, Erica.
I was just going to jump in. So I agree with Ed that the issues we covered here today, there's certainly some distance between our policy positions. But then there's issues like occupational licensing reform, where we have seen Joe Biden actually speak out about how unfair a lot of the country's licensing laws are, and that there's been an increase where now 20% of professions require some type of license. And a lot of times the license requirements are really not equitable, as far as they don't really equate to public safety. And it's preventing people from really getting ahead. And we've seen Joe Biden speak out there. So it's possible that's an area for common ground.
This is Rob. I'll agree with Ed. I think traditional labor law, there's very little opportunity, but there are elements outside of our jurisdiction that we share jurisdiction on, things like portable benefits. I think there's bipartisan interest in trying to figure out a path forward, particularly while we're protecting the independent contractor model. There needs to be some more thought given to how those workers can find a way to access some of that, and there's good thinking going on our side of the aisle, and but I'm not sure we can get to critical mass, but that's definitely an area for consideration.
Thanks. We have a question here that's dealing with ability to kind of mitigate the Democrats' liberal agenda, and I know that labor policy really touches into all different areas here, and so this question is looking at how could their agenda on climate change affect, say the oil and gas industry, and recognizing that that's a energy security and national security issue as well. Do any of you have suggestions on how to kind of mitigate those extreme agendas?
Rachel, I'll just jump in maybe with a quick response here, that I think we can talk about how innovation has alleviated a lot of some of the climate change concerns, and how we should be really tackling regulatory reform in this way, whether that's, I know on nuclear plants, I want to say that the last time there was a new nuclear power plant, it was more than 30 years ago, just because it's so difficult with the current regulations and licensing in place, essentially. So I think one thing that for common ground and kind of where we can bridge that gap is specifically in the area of innovation to tackle a lot of the environmental concerns. And we've seen states that have had these more favorable policies have not just affordable energy, right, but actually improve their environment as well.
Thanks, Erica. And I'm just going to ask one more here. Ed, you talked a fair bit about, the new requirements that might come out related to COVID-19, but I've also heard, that other OSHA issues would be a big one moving forward. Can you just talk a little bit about how, now where you are in the Retail Foundation, how does that impact a company? I think that everybody tends to think, oh, these are just safety regulations, and of course they need to be there. But dealing with the day-to-day of actually, enacting those policies and just the burden that creates. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I came to this job, honestly, I hadn't given OSHA a lot of thought. OSHA's been even really throughout much of the Obama administration, much less the Trump administration, OSHA hasn't really been a big factor. And I think really, even going back, really, OSHA has been relatively calm since ergonomics was repealed in 2001, going way back. I would say, from a liberal governance perspective, from the union's perspective, they need OSHA to matter again. And I really think there's going to be, they had the kind of the driving force, and Rob remembers this well, behind ergonomics back in the late 90s. The argument was that OSHA was going to essentially rot on the vine, that the whole design of the agency was essentially going to be thrown to the wayside by technology. That old time, the old time factories, the old time unionized facilities were just going away. The old Rust Belt was going, and so they tried. The whole idea behind ergonomics was to bring this regulatory regime into the modern workplace, into keyboards, essentially. That was really the thrust. How that's gonna look in the Biden administration, I just don't know, and I'm sure Rob and Erica probably have some ideas on that too. But my guess is, to answer your more specific question, that that they are going to try to humiliate the companies they come after. They are going to try to basically do away with opinion letters so that you have to guess as to their interpretation on guidance. They're going to make it as difficult as possible to essentially comply with their law, to comply with their regulations, and they're going to humiliate employers on the way out.
Thanks, Ed. Well, I think that concludes our panel today. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your insights, and also about the audience for your great questions that we're engaging here. I hope that you can join Vinny and I again at the same time, same place next week for part 2 of our Safeguarding Worker Freedom series, where Michael Saltzman, who is the Managing Director of the Employment Policies Institute, will join Vinny and I to discuss the future of work beyond just 2021. So if you work on the Hill, at a think tank, or have any questions, please contact us using the information listed on the screen. We would love to continue this conversation. Immediately following this event, you'll receive a survey that we hope you'll complete so that we can bring ideas that you care about to the public square. And to see the events that we have coming up, please check out heritage.org/events. Again, thank you and have a great day.